Okay, so colonialism. First off, when we say colonialism, we mean specifically European colonialism, right? Colonialism and imperialism have a long history. In fact, much of the region is Arab today because of Arab imperialism and colonialism that came out of Arabia in the 7th century, right? The Mongols were imperial and colonial, but their colonial rule, instead of assimilating others to their identity, which lacked a written text, a religious code like the Quran, didn't happen. Instead, the Mongols assimilated to the communities they conquered in many cases. But if you look at the history of various dynasties in China, or how Russia became Russia, you know, Europe by no means has a monopoly on imperialism and colonialism, whatever the discourse today might make it sound like. That much said, there is a specific way that European imperial conquest of other regions occurs, and a way that colonial or neo-colonial rule is imposed on other people that is specific to the post-industrial revolution capitalist world economy that is created in this era. And in fact, it's inseparable from those factors. So there are some perhaps unique aspects to European colonialism and the way it penetrates the MENA region and impacts it even to this day. In this chapter, I promised to provide you, that I'm going to put on Blackboard, it specifically goes into some examples of how this happened. Long before soldiers arrived from Her Majesty's Navy or the French Republic to rule over some of the countries in the MENA region, we had loans, financial loans, to various rulers, Muhammad Ali of Egypt, the various Ottoman sultans, various shahs and leaders in Persia and Iran, and others, which opened the door, so to speak. These leaders in the MENA region, some of them good leaders, some of them not so good leaders, are looking for capital, for finances to modernize and compete with Europe and with each other and with others. They need loans to do it. Now the problem is, these loans sometimes, more often than not, don't turn out so well. They're either taken under bad advice or taken under duress with terms that are very onerous, and they open the door for neo-colonial control and sometimes direct colonial control. So the British take over in Egypt, for instance, after loans to build the Suez Canal become unsustainable for Egypt, and Egypt can't pay back, and so Britain sends troops to physically take over. That starts with a loan, okay? With these loans, often as various states in the MENA region have trouble making payments on their loans, they're forced to make concessions. So we talked about the Ottoman Empire and the concessions and the special privileges that foreigners got. Often these came as a result of loans. And these gave foreigners preferential business rights, which in turn made it harder for locals to succeed economically and harmed the local economy, especially if you had capital flight occurring because of these special privileges and so forth. And sometimes they even led to instability. So in the reading I'm sending you, we have Ismail Pasha of Egypt taking out big loans under unfavorable terms to expand Egyptian cotton cultivation. Maybe hindsight's 20/20, but he did the math and he said, okay, if I borrow this amount of money from various creditors, including especially British creditors, to change much of Egyptian agriculture from wheat and other staples to a cash crop like cotton, cotton's selling for this much money on the world market. I can not only pay back the loans, but have the money to import the food that we're not going to be growing and feed everyone, and then still have more money left over to modernize and industrialize. Seems like a great deal, right? So around 1862, he takes out all these loans. What's happening in 1862?
The American Revolution.
Civil War.
Civil War, excuse me.
So what happened during the U.S. Civil War to cotton? The South was embargoed, right? So world cotton prices, what do you think happened to them? They skyrocketed. And Ismail Pasha does his math under those conditions. Well, what happens in 1865? Civil War ends. All that cotton comes back on the market. What happens to cotton prices? What happens to Egypt's ability to pay back the loans with all the fields it converted from wheat to cotton? When those loans cannot be repaid back, what do the creditors do? Same thing as if you have a mortgage and you can't pay it. They start to seize assets. Okay? And those loans were in part also taken out to build the Suez Canal, which was supposed to facilitate the shipping of the cotton to the world markets. Everything crashes, and Egypt essentially loses its independence. David?
It's actually interesting you just brought this up because a few days ago I read an article about a debt crisis in Turkey where 40% of loans in Turkey are foreign held loans that are issued in euros or dollars, and because the lira is so
Is
devalued,
tumbling?
they're having such difficulty paying back these massive loans.
Yeah.
There's a huge credit shortage in Turkey. The inflation rate is out of control, and then they have so many foreign debts, they can't pay them.
Right, it was a very effective strategy for a couple of years that led to several electoral victories for the AKP party, because you take out all these loans and you privatize big industries. Turkey also did this, and these countries in the 1800s did this as well. In the modern Turkish example of like the last 10 years, Turkey took things like the telephone company, Turk Telecom, and privatized it. They sold it off. So they got an influx of money from that and the loans and so forth. And then they start spending that money on infrastructure, on other things, and everyone's getting jobs and doing well. And they're like, yay, this government is great. Well, you know, Turk Telecom was a profit-making, publicly owned company. So you got a short-term infusion of cash, and now you don't have the income from Turk Telecom. Some private people who may keep the profits in some numbered account in Switzerland or something have the profits. Your source of revenue has declined. The infrastructure projects that you built, you gave a lot of those projects to political allies of yours to keep them on board. And maybe the money wasn't always spent as effectively as it could be. You were in the middle of the pyramid and so forth. And suddenly all those bills are coming due and no one wants to lend you more money because it's not clear that you'll be able to pay it back. You're in for a hell of a storm under these circumstances. Unless you can find new donors, like Qatar, Turkey and Qatar have a good alliance and so forth. Or in Egypt's case, like no one. And the British come in and they take over. And they lose their independence. The reading I'm going to send you also has a big example of Iran under the Qajar dynasty, where the ruler gave Baron Julius de Ruyter, who was a UK citizen. This is where Reuters Press Service, the name comes from, I believe. They needed some money, the Qajar ruler, I forget his name, needed some short-term money. You know, there's always a war to fight or some domestic rebellion to quell or some project you want to do that you think is going to solve your problems. He wants a short-term infusion of cash, and he gets it in return for giving Baron Julius de Ruyter a monopoly over railways, mines, irrigation construction, all future factories, telegraph lines, roads, and the next 25 years of customs collections. Okay, all in return for a small flat payment and a pretty small share of profits from those ventures in the future. There are riots in the street in Iran over the terms of this deal. The instability itself cost the Iranian economy huge sums, and in this particular case, the Shah, if it was the Shah or the Qajars, he had to rescind the deal and pay a penalty to Baron Julius de Ruyter. In other cases, those monopolies happen, and the whole country suffers for a very long time. Okay? Sometimes you have inept rulers. Sometimes you have good ones. Maybe Ismail Pasha of Egypt was a good one. He just made a bad call on cotton. It's hard to predict what the market's going to do. Maybe he thought the U.S. Civil War was going to last 10 years longer than it really did, right? Not a terribly unreasonable assumption, but that's not how it plays out, you know? In any case, the whole country's on the hook for the debt, and it can be very difficult to extricate yourself from. And so, we do have cases of just military conquest, like the Italians going in to take Libya, or Napoleon lands in Egypt in, what was it, 1798, with a fleet of ships. He has like 300 ships, and he just goes to conquer Egypt. Okay? So that's the colonialism we can do, but even more often, or in the case of Algeria, the what was it, the famous slap where the
Last water incident.
right, the Ottoman ruler of Algeria slaps the French ambassador, and France invades.
It took them 40 years or 30 years.
Yeah. So that's all the excuse they needed. You know, there's a power asymmetry, and the other country's like, yeah, we're not going to take this, and you're going to suffer now. That's normally what we think of, but often, including places like Turkey, which was never colonized, or Iran, which was never colonized, it's not the direct imposition of troops and direct rule, but a kind of neo-colonialism where there's special concessions made for the foreigners, and your finance ministry isn't totally under your control. So it comes in various forms for different countries. In some cases, the very state is created by the colonists, by the colonialists, I should say. So why did I include the Gertrude Bell article in your readings this week? This is an example, maybe of Sir Archibald Knapsalot creating a new country on the map. And isn't it kind of remarkable to read excerpts from her letters home? How she's so excited about creating a new country, and she hates the French and the Zionists, and this will show them it'll be such a successful country, and it's remarkable. But she was not someone unfamiliar with Iran. She knew it intimately, unlike on the Daily Show video. But it's still, the Daily Show catches it right in that it is just kind of like someone from outside with some maps and crayons taking a couple of Ottoman districts. In this case, it was the Ottoman districts of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul, and chopping them off the Ottoman holdings and creating a new country that they're going to call Iraq with it. And then there's this whole argument about, well, the Mosul governorate is mostly Kurdish. Do we allow for a Kurdish state up there? And there's all these arguments back and forth, and finally it's like, no, they'll give us too many problems with Turkey, and so that was the essence of the reasoning. And so that decision is not made. And then we get a history of like 12 Kurdish revolts in Iraq alone after that. So there are ramifications from these choices that Gertrude Bell and others are making, not in the interest of the people, but in their own interest. William?
Yeah, I'm curious for your personal opinion on this. When it comes to carving up the Middle East after the fall of the Ottoman Empire and all that, was there a correct way to do it, or was it just going to be a mess no matter what?
That's a really good question. It's a really good question. I'll jump ahead to answer it. I pulled something out from the Atlantic magazine by a fellow named Nick Danforth, who writes pretty often some good pieces. And in this piece, he's reacting to a common refrain where people say, the problems of the Middle East are because of the Sykes-Picot borders. So we had it on the quiz, right? And in the readings, the Sykes-Picot agreement. So this is taken as a representative of Sir Archibald Mapsalot and his French counterpart getting together and like with their colored pencils. And so when someone says the Sykes-Picot borders of the Middle East, what they're referring to is the colonially created borders of the Middle East following World War I, which, just like in The Daily Show, are said to pay no attention to more natural, ethnic, linguistic, religious contours of the region and so forth, and create these states in the imperialist interest. So he's reacting to this. Especially it's the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Sèvres right now. He was reacting to this, I think I pulled the article out 3 years ago, and it was the 100th anniversary of the Sykes-Picot agreement. Okay, and so let me read you a little bit of what he says. He says, the idea that better borders, drawn with careful attention to the region's ethnic and religious diversity, would have spared the Middle East a century's worth of violence, is especially provocative at a moment when Western powers weigh the merits of intervention in the region. Unfortunately, this critique overstates how arbitrary today's Middle East borders really are, overlooks how arbitrary every other border in the world is, implies that better borders were possible, and ignores the cynical imperial practices that actually did sow conflict in the region. So he argues that in Iraq, for instance, the Ottomans actually treated Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul as one region in practice, that those three had some history of being together. He says the Iran-Iraq border was a long-standing border since the 16th century, and as natural as any, but there were many wars between the Persians and the Ottomans over time. He says Jordan is probably the most artificial state of all. We'll discuss it starting 2 weeks from now when we do the Arab-Israeli conflict. But it's been the most stable. Right? Jordan has no basis in history for its creation, but it's been one of the more stable, successful states. So going on a bit more of what he says, in Iraq, for example, creating smaller independent states would only have prefigured the conflicts dividing Iraq today. A predominantly Kurdish state built around the old Ottoman province of Mosul would almost inevitably have become ensnared in the ongoing conflict between the Republic of Turkey and its own Kurdish minority. Similarly, Shiite Iran would have had religious grounds to try to incorporate a small Shiite state based around Basra, whereas a state based around the central province of Baghdad would have hated to sit back and watch neighbors grow rich off of oil deposits that it lacked, because the oil in Iraq is in the north and the south, and not in Baghdad. So what if the British and French had instead endorsed the logic of Pan-Arabism and created one big Arab state out of the region? Well, any such state would still have faced difficulty with its Christian, Kurdish, and Shiite minorities. If I were to break it down for you, he's saying that if you try to be more sensitive to the ethno-sectarian differences, well, what, do you make Baghdad and Basra an Arab state, but then Basra is mostly Shiite and Baghdad has more Sunnis, and what if the non-Arab state of Iran next door, which is a naturally formed state, says, well, those Shiites should be with us because we're Shiite. You understand? There's competing sources of ideological glue for a state. And then he adds that in the Balkans, the people were left to draw their own borders, and that hasn't been exactly a shining success of peace and stability, and those borders are natural, not colonially created. So he finishes with, the fundamental problem was, and still is, that the world doesn't have any authentic or natural borders, just waiting to be identified and transcribed onto a map. Europe's real borders owe, and he puts that in quotation marks, owe their current legitimacy, such as it is, to continent-wide exhaustion following several centuries of fighting. So he thinks the real negative legacy of colonialism is not so much the maps, but divide and rule practices, destruction of old patterns replaced by, of doing things and ruling, replaced by more centralized authoritarian ones, combined with the technological tools to repress the people, changes in land holdings, indebtedness, things like that, which we can talk more about. David, your hand was up?
About the point that he makes about Sunni Shia split,